The Galactic Tribunal sat at the heart of the cosmos, overseeing all matters of justice throughout the galaxy. It was revered as the ultimate authority, wielding the power to decide the fate of individuals, species, and even entire worlds. The tribunal prided itself on its unyielding adherence to logic, cold calculation, and what they called fairness. To them, every decision was pure, devoid of emotion, and based solely on facts. However, for those who found themselves in front of the tribunal, it felt more like judgment from gods than from impartial overseers. They decided without compassion, passing sentences with the weight of universal law behind them. Their most feared form of punishment was exile to the Deathworlds, planets so dangerous that no sane creature could survive. These planets, scattered throughout the galaxy, were hostile in every imaginable way: relentless storms, ravenous predators, unstable environments. They were used as execution grounds, a slow, torturous end for those who had committed the gravest offenses. Few, if any, survived more than a few hours. To be sentenced to a death world was to be erased, your death as inevitable as it was gruesome. John Harris, a human from Earth, stood before this tribunal. Accused of defying the Galactic Empire's rule, his crime was only hinted at in whispers around the room. The specifics were not discussed openly, but the tribunal's distaste for him was evident. Defiance of the Empire, particularly by a human, a species still seen as primitive by many, was something that could not go unpunished. As the sentence was read out, John stood there, silent, his face calm. Most species, when sentenced to a death world, begged, screamed, or fainted. The fear of such a fate usually broke even the hardest criminals. But not John. His steady gaze unsettled the tribunal. They expected panic, fear, anything but this eerie calm. In the courtroom, murmurs began to circulate among the onlookers. What did this human know? Why was he not afraid? The tribunal members glanced at each other, clearly perturbed by his reaction. To them, this was an open and shut case. The human had defied their laws, and the punishment was clear. But John's demeanor planted a seed of doubt. Perhaps they had miscalculated. Still, their decision had been made. His execution would take place on Cynos, a death world known for its savage storms, unpredictable wildlife, and hostile terrain. It was, they believed, the perfect place to break a human. As the details of Cynos were announced, the room fell silent. The planet was infamous, even among the cold-hearted judges of the tribunal. It was a world where nature itself seemed designed to kill. Its atmosphere was turbulent, the surface ravaged by constant storms, and the creatures that called it home were aggressive, hunting anything they sensed. No one had ever survived Cynos. It wasn't just a death world, it was the death world. John didn't flinch. This unnerved the tribunal further. Behind their stoic expressions, they exchanged uneasy glances. How could this human remain so calm? They had seen countless beings break under the mere mention of Cynos, yet here stood a man facing his demise with an unsettling composure. What the tribunal didn't understand was that John Harris had a secret. Unlike other species who relied on advanced technology and comfort, humans were shaped by adversity. Their home planet, Earth, had been called a death world by some species. Although nowhere near as hostile as Cynos, Earth's history had hardened its inhabitants. For millennia, humans had fought wars, survived natural disasters, and thrived in conditions others would deem uninhabitable. This resilience was something the tribunal couldn't comprehend. They had viewed humanity through the lens of their own superiority, assuming them weak and inferior. But John knew differently. He had grown up learning how to survive. And he was not going to let the tribunal know what he was truly capable of. The tribunal, believing they were sealing his fate, made their final remarks. They spoke of justice and order, of the Galactic Empire's need to maintain control. John listened quietly, absorbing every word. But deep within, he was already preparing for what lay ahead. His mind, sharpened by years of survival instinct, began to assess what he would need to do to survive Cynos. The tribunal had no idea they were not just sentencing a man to death. They were setting the stage for something they could not possibly understand. As the court dismissed and the sentence was finalized, the audience murmured once more. Some viewed this as an overreach. After all, the human had simply defied the Empire's rule. Others saw it as necessary, a demonstration of the tribunal's power. But what remained on everyone's mind was the human's strange, unsettling calm. The look in his eyes as he was led away left a mark on those present. It was not fear, but something far more dangerous, confidence. In the cold, sterile corridors of the tribunal's chambers, the judges gathered to discuss their decision. They believed it was just and fair, but beneath their veneer of certainty, there was doubt. Was Cynos truly the right choice? Some felt they should have chosen a less notorious planet, one that would allow them to study the human's behavior more closely before his demise. But it was too late now. Cynos had been chosen, and John Harris was en route to his fate. As the tribunal members debated in hushed voices, one thing remained clear: they had underestimated John. To them, humans were a curious anomaly, a species that had only recently entered the galactic stage. They viewed humans as primitive, technologically inferior, and soft. This was their mistake. John, like so many humans before him, carried the weight of his species' history. He knew hardship. He knew how to fight. And most importantly, he knew how to survive. In a distant corner of the galaxy, John's transport ship made its way to Cynos, cutting through the cold void of space. Inside, John remained as calm as ever, his thoughts already ahead of him. He was planning, calculating, adapting. The tribunal had sentenced him to death, but John had no intention of dying on Cynos. The galaxy had just made a grave miscalculation, and they were about to learn the true strength of humanity. The ship descended into the atmosphere of Cynos, cutting through layers of thick clouds and turbulence. The temperature inside the transport dropped as the howling winds outside intensified. John Harris was silent as the descent modules shook violently. Through the small viewport, he could see the jagged mountains below, the endless expanse of desolation stretching as far as the eye could see. The tribunal had chosen their execution ground well. Cynos was a world designed to kill. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with humidity, and the land was a labyrinth of hostile terrain and lurking threats. The module's door hissed open, revealing the hellscape outside. John stepped out, his eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, the module sealed and lifted off, leaving him completely alone. He took in the surroundings: sharp, rocky cliffs, the distant roars of unknown creatures, and the fierce winds that whipped through the canyons. To any other being, this was certain death. But to John, it was a challenge he intended to conquer. Far above, the tribunal's monitors clicked to life, broadcasting John's every move. They watched, expecting him to struggle immediately, as most did upon landing. But what they saw was different. John didn't panic. His expression remained calm, methodical. He moved with purpose, and this was not lost on the observers. They had expected him to falter. He was human, after all. Yet he seemed unshaken, his every step precise. John knew his first priority was shelter. The heat was unbearable, and the storms would come soon. He scoured the area and found a series of caves not far from the landing site. With a sharp eye, he selected one that offered protection from the elements and potential predators. Inside, he used broken shards of rock to carve out defensive spikes at the entrance, ensuring no creature would sneak up on him while he rested. As he worked, his mind stayed focused, sharp. He had been preparing for this from the moment he left the tribunal's courtroom. Hours passed, and the first storm hit. The winds howled through the mountains, ripping through the landscape with ferocious intensity. Inside his makeshift shelter, John remained safe. He knew the terrain would be more of a threat than any one creature, but his instincts guided him. His body, honed by years of hard labor and survival training, responded without hesitation. Finding water was next. He ventured into the jagged valleys, observing the flow of the air and how it shaped the land. A shallow stream ran through the rocks, its water murky but drinkable after filtration. He used his shirt as a filter, collecting the liquid in hollowed-out rocks and storing enough for the days ahead. The tribunal observed with growing unease. They had assumed the human would flail, but instead, John was adapting faster than they could have imagined. He had not only found water but had made a fire using the flint from the stones and dry brush he gathered along the way. This was not supposed to happen. No creature sentenced to Sinos had ever established a camp within the first few hours, and yet John had done it as if he were on a simple survival mission. What shocked the tribunal even more was what happened next. As John settled into his shelter, the ground trembled. A deep growl echoed through the cave. From the shadows emerged a predator, massive, with eyes that gleamed in the dark. Its scales shimmered, its claws sharp enough to tear through the toughest of hides. The tribunal leaned in closer to their monitors, waiting for the inevitable. There was no way the human could survive an encounter with such a creature. They had seen it tear apart countless prisoners before. But John did not run. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the creature. He calculated its movements, waiting for the right moment. As the predator lunged, John sidestepped with incredible speed, using the narrow cave to his advantage. The creature slammed into the cave wall, disoriented for just a moment. That was all John needed. He grabbed one of the sharpened spikes he had prepared earlier and drove it into the beast's neck. The predator collapsed, lifeless, at his feet. The tribunal was speechless. This was not the reaction they had anticipated. In mere hours, John had outsmarted the environment, adapted to the planet, and killed one of Sinos' most dangerous predators. What made it even more unsettling for them was the ease with which he did it. To him, this was just another obstacle to overcome. Inside his shelter, John stared at the creature's body. He didn't feel victorious. This was survival. The tribunal's expectations meant nothing to him. He had already decided that Sinos would not be his grave. He was fighting not just against the planet but against the very notion that humans were weak, inferior. In his mind, this was not just about living, it was about defying everything the galaxy believed about his species. As night fell, John skinned the creature, using its hide for additional protection against the cold. He cooked its flesh over the fire, the crackling sound echoing in the silence of the cave. His mind, always working, thought ahead. The next few days would be critical. He would have to move, find more resources, perhaps even explore the other side of the mountains for better shelter. But he was ready. In the tribunal's chambers, unease turned to genuine concern. They had expected John to die within the first day, yet here he was, thriving. The conversation among the judges shifted. Was this an anomaly, or had they grossly underestimated the resilience of humans? The data suggested the latter. They reviewed footage of Earth, its wars, its natural disasters, its history. The planet, though not as hostile as Sinos, had forged its inhabitants in the fires of adversity. John Harris was the embodiment of that human tenacity. As John sat by the fire, his mind drifted. He knew the tribunal was watching. Every move he made, every decision, was being scrutinized. But that didn't matter. The real battle was not against the planet or its creatures, it was against the expectations of those who thought they had already won. He would prove them wrong. He would show them what it meant to be human, to face death and not just survive, but thrive. Days passed, and the monitors showed what no one had expected. John Harris was not only alive but thriving. His every action was now a source of growing discomfort for the tribunal. Each moment they watched him survive in an environment that should have broken him, their unease deepened. The harsh conditions of Sinos, its suffocating heat, relentless storms, and brutal predators, had claimed every life that had ever been sent there. But John, the human, remained unfazed. He adapted. Where others had succumbed to fear and despair, John showed resilience that bordered on the impossible. In the quiet halls of the tribunal, murmurs grew louder. What had initially seemed like an open and shut case was unraveling before their eyes. Some members began to voice their doubts in private conversations. Maybe they had miscalculated, they whispered. Perhaps this human was an exception. Others dismissed the notion entirely, chalking up John's survival to mere luck. They argued that his time would come, that no one, human or otherwise, could outlast the merciless nature of Sinos forever. But beneath their justifications, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was spreading. The galaxy was watching. Word had spread quickly. A human, sentenced to die on a death world, was still alive, and not just barely, he was thriving. The news had reached every corner of space, igniting curiosity and fascination among countless species. To many, humans were still an enigma. They had only recently joined the galactic stage, and though they were considered primitive, stories of their resilience were now gaining attention. Species from harsh worlds, planets where survival was a daily battle, watched with growing admiration. They saw in John a reflection of their own struggles, a kindred spirit who refused to bow to the forces that sought to break him. Alien communities gathered around public broadcasts, captivated by the human's defiance. Some cheered him on, others watched in silence, but all shared the same thought: how was this possible? What was it about this species that allowed them to endure what should have been certain death? John had become a symbol, not just of human endurance, but of the indomitable will that could rise in the face of insurmountable odds. Back on Cynos, John wasn't simply surviving anymore. The tides had turned, and now, he was shaping the world around him. He had gone beyond mere survival tactics. Using the natural resources Cynos provided, John began to build. He fashioned traps using the planet's own materials, setting up defenses that allowed him to move freely without constant threat. Fortifications rose around his shelter, simple yet effective. He carved out a system of protection that made him not just a survivor, but a master of his environment. What the Tribunal had failed to understand was that humanity's strength wasn't in their technology or their physical prowess. It was in their ability to adapt, to turn hostile environments into opportunities. John's actions on Cynos weren't just the instinctual movements of a desperate man, they were calculated, deliberate. He had a plan, and with each passing day, that plan was becoming clearer. He wasn't just living on Cynos, he was bending it to his will. The members of the Tribunal watched in mounting desperation. It was one thing for a prisoner to survive longer than expected, but John was thriving in ways that defied logic. His ability to manipulate the planet's resources made them question everything they had assumed about him, and about humans. This was not the outcome they had envisioned. The Tribunal's reputation was built on infallibility. Their judgments were final, their decisions absolute. But now, the galaxy was watching a human defy their ultimate sentence, and it was shaking the very foundation of their authority. Behind closed doors, the debate raged. Some members suggested intervening, finding a way to stop John before his continued survival became a public embarrassment. But to interfere now would be an admission of failure, something the Tribunal could not afford. Their power depended on the perception of perfection, and altering the course of John's sentence would reveal cracks in their infallibility. Others argued for patience, insisting that the planet would eventually claim him, that no one could continue to defy death indefinitely. But each day that passed made their argument weaker. What unnerved the Tribunal even more was the growing suspicion that John knew he was being watched. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore, he was playing to an audience. He left subtle signs, small details that seemed almost like messages directed at the Tribunal itself. A figure carved into a rock formation, a pattern of stones arranged just so, symbols that suggested John was fully aware of the surveillance, and worse yet, that he was toying with them. He wasn't just surviving Cynos. He was mocking the very system that had sentenced him there. The judges, once so confident in their decision, now found themselves questioning everything. What if they had misjudged not just John, but humanity itself? What if this so-called primitive species had depths of strength and resilience they hadn't accounted for? The Tribunal had sentenced John to die on Cynos, but now, they feared that they might have unleashed something far more dangerous, a symbol of defiance that could inspire others to question their authority. As the days turned into weeks, John Harris was no longer just a man surviving on a death world. He had become a living testament to the power of the human spirit, a force that even the cold, calculating logic of the Galactic Tribunal had failed to understand. The galaxy watched, captivated, as John continued to thrive. And the Tribunal, for the first time in its long history, was truly afraid, John had been planning his escape from the very beginning. Every step he took on Cynos had a purpose. He wasn't just gathering materials to survive, he was carefully selecting resources that could be used for something more. The creatures he had killed, the plants he had studied, the minerals he had collected, all of it was part of a larger plan. Cynos was a deadly world, but it was also rich in the elements. He needed to build something that could change his fate. While the tribunal believed they had trapped him in a perfect execution ground, John saw opportunity. He was going to contact help and leave this planet behind. In the solitude of his shelter, John had fashioned a crude but functional signal transmitter. Using the electromagnetic storms that swept across Cynos, he could amplify a signal strong enough to reach human colonies or ships passing through the outer reaches of the galaxy. The work had been meticulous, every piece scavenged or crafted from the planet's natural resources. The technology was basic compared to what other species used, but it was enough. All he needed was one moment, one pulse of contact, and he could call for help. The tribunal, however, had been watching closely. They had grown increasingly nervous with every day that passed, and when they noticed John's unusual activities, they suspected something more was at play. The decision was made, intervention was required. They couldn't let this defiance continue. A team of their best was dispatched to recapture John and bring him back, dead or alive. They weren't willing to let him escape and risk the embarrassment of their ultimate sentence being undermined. The elite force landed on Cynos, confident in their mission. Trained in hostile environments, they believed they could handle whatever challenge the human posed. But they had underestimated John's preparation. He wasn't just surviving, he had turned the planet into his ally. As the team advanced, they found themselves caught in a web of traps and obstacles. John had mapped out every weakness in the terrain and used the natural environment to his advantage. Predators, previously tamed by John's careful manipulation, became weapons in his defense. Every step the elite team took was met with resistance, confusion, and danger. John didn't flee or hide. He confronted them head-on. Armed with nothing more than what the planet had provided, he engaged the tribunal's forces, using his knowledge of Cynos to outwit them. The elite force, despite their advanced training and superior technology, found themselves overwhelmed by the humans' tenacity and resourcefulness. They had expected a simple capture mission, but what they faced was a calculated onslaught. One by one they fell, their confidence shattered as they realized they were outmatched not by superior firepower, but by a human sheer will to survive. In the midst of the battle, John stood tall, unbroken. His message was clear without needing words: humans were not to be underestimated. The tribunal had sent their best, and they had failed. As the final member of the elite force fell, John knew his time on Cynos was coming to an end. He activated the signal transmitter, sending out a pulse into the galaxy, a call for help. He knew it wouldn't take long before someone would respond. He had done the impossible, survived, thrived, and now, he would escape. Before leaving, John had one last act of defiance. With the cameras still watching, he approached the bodies of the fallen soldiers, making it clear to the tribunal that he had won. He looked directly into the monitors, knowing they were still watching from afar. His message wasn't one of arrogance or revenge, it was a simple truth. Humans were not what the galaxy thought. Their strength didn't come from their advanced technology or physical power. It came from their mind, their ability to adapt, and their indomitable will to survive against all odds. The galaxy had underestimated humans for too long, and now, they had to face the consequences of that. John's final act was his escape from Cynos. When the rescue ship arrived, he left the desolate planet behind, but the impact of his actions reverberated across the galaxy. The tribunal, once so confident in their ability to control life and death, was now faced with a reality they had never considered. Their authority had been challenged, not by a powerful empire or an advanced species, but by a single human. It was a blow to their reputation, one that would not be easily forgotten. The galaxy began to shift. Other species, particularly those from harsh environments, saw John's defiance as a symbol of hope. They too had been dismissed, underestimated, and controlled by the powers that be. But now, with John's story spreading, they realized that they were not alone in their struggle. Humanity, once viewed as weak, had proven themselves capable of not just surviving but defying the odds in ways that no one had anticipated. The tribunal, for their part, was forced to reconsider their approach. They couldn't afford another mistake like this. Their judgment had been flawed, their assumptions about humanity wrong. They had seen humans as a primitive race, but now they understood that humans possessed a depth of strength and resilience that made them far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The tribunal's control over the galaxy had been shaken, and they knew that other species might soon follow in John's footsteps. John's escape from Sinos wasn't just a victory for himself, it was the beginning of something much larger. The galaxy had changed, and humanity's place in it had been rewritten. No longer would they be seen as weak or insignificant. John had shown the galaxy the true potential of humans, and in doing so, had paved the way for a future where humanity could rise, not as subjects of the galactic powers, but as equals, or perhaps even as something greater. As John's ship disappeared into the vastness of space, the story of his defiance on Sinos became legend. It was the tale of a human who, against all odds, had faced the deadliest environment the galaxy could offer and had come out victorious. It was a story of strength, of survival, and of the unbreakable spirit that defined humanity. And it was only the beginning.